The air in the dockyard hung heavy with the damp, metallic scent of industry, a perpetual fog of iron filings, ozone, and wet wood. The sun, a pale, struggling disk even at midday, cast a diffused, oily light over the massive slips where the steel ribs of their next vessel were taking form. It was here, in the cold embrace of the coastal that the vessel designated to carry a small, intensely focused world into the depths was being forged. The great hull of the Type 7 U-boat, a vessel that would become known only by numerical designation U-96, was a curve of raw, unyielding steel. It was not built for comfort or for grace on the surface, but for the silent, crushing ballet beneath. Its double skin, the inner pressure hull and the lighter outer casing, represented a profound commitment to physics, a compact shield designed to withstand the non-negotiable weight of the North Atlantic. The sounds of the shipyard were a relentless, rhythmic lullaby to the men who taught. The percussive drumming of the riveters was perhaps the most dominant note, a high, sharp clankling-lang that echoed off the cavernous shed roofs, a sound-off, aggressive construction that somehow managed to be soothing in its regularity. It spoke of progress, of the slow, inevitable forming of a perfect machine. The air moved in slow, heavy currents, carrying the faint, sharp smell of newly cut metal mixing with the deep, earthy odor of the river water sloshing against the piles. Thuarkers moved with a practiced, economical efficiency. They were artisans of steel, their hands rough and blackened, each motion a part of a complex, silent ritual. They knew the exact temperature a rivet needed to be, the precise force of the hammer blow to seat it perfectly, making the hull a singular, continuous structure. This was not just a boat, it was a pressurized chamber, a temporary refuge against the forces of nature and war. The work was long, stretching through the short, perpetually overcast days of Thenetherne winter. The light bulbs strung high above the slipways cast a yellow, artificial ore that mingled poorly with the weak sunlight, creating a murky, dreamlike. The massive cranes moved overhead with a slow, almost sleepy grown-off gears and cables, lifting plates of steel that weighed many tons, placing them with the delicate precision of a watchmaker. A welcome to the deep. The surface of the ocean is a place of endless, turbulent restlessness, but beneath that volatile skin, a different world exists, a world of profound, silent pressure and mechanical calm. This is where we journey now, descending into the historic occurrence of a deep and solitary conflict. Allow the sounds of the deep, the steady-hum of distant engines, and the rhythmic description of life within the steel hull to guide your mind toward a place of rest. The interior of the hull, as it neared completion, was a labyrinth of exposed pipes, wires, and machinery. It was an environment designed for absolute utility. There was no extraneous space. Every cubic centimeter was designated for fuel, battery, weapon, or to walk through the emerging vessel was to step into a metallic skeleton whereat senses were immediately assaulted by the geometry of purpose. The men who would eventually call this place home would have no luxury of open. The bunks, 3 high, were tightly packed into the forward and aft torpedo rooms, mere metal shelves separated by inches of air and thin mattress. The galley, a minuscule corner near the control room, would be a perpetual source of low heat and the complex, competing aromas of boiling coffee, preserved meat, and diesel. The U-96 was fitted with its twin massive diesel engines, the heart of the They were heavy, oiled, precision-engineered beasts, designed to push the boat across vast distances. Once lowered into the hull, they would be immediately covered and encased, a permanent fixture that would vibrate through the decks and bulkheads during their operation. Even when silent, they retained the heavy, almost pungent scent of lubricating oil and spent fuel, a constant perfume of the machine that would mingle with every other smell in the boat. The electrical batteries were installed low in the center of the boat, under the deck. These were the true lungs of the underwater vessel, massive blocks of lead andesite, capable of providing silent power for hours, but requiring constant careful attention. In operation, they subtly released the faint, acrid smell of sulfuric acid and ozone, a smell that meant the boat was running silent and deep, a sign of its invisibility, yet also a subtle, ever-present danger if not ventilated correctly. That as the commissioning approached, the atmosphere shifted from the raw chaotic energy of construction to the quiet, focused anticipation of the naval cruise. The paint was applied a deep, purposeful gray over the steel. The final fittings were screwed in, the polished brass of the gauges, the rubber gaskets of the heavy circular hatches, the varnished wood of the map table in the control room, the brain and nerve center of the boat was a place of intense, complex organization. Every valve, every lever, every switch had a precise purpose and a known location, even in the darkness. The floor plates here, worn smooth by the soles of countless boots, carried the low, heavy weight of the sea above them. The room was dominated by the two large depth gauges, their faces like calm, watchful eyes, ready to chart the descent into the pressure abyss. The sound in the dockyard had now changed from the harsh clamor of the hammer to soft lapping of water. The U-96 was finally afloat, resting heavy in the dark water. The commissioning ceremony itself was brief, a matter of tradition and official signature. The moment the vessel was officially handed over to the Kriegsmarine, the entire being of the machine seemed to change. It was no longer a construction project. It was a commissioned warship, imbued with a new, sober purpose. The newly formed crew, their uniforms crisp and dark, began the laborious, detailed process of making the boat their own. Every tool was checked, every pipe traced, every emergency procedure rehearsed until it became a muscle memory, an unconscious response to the environment. The captain, a stern, quiet man, walked the length of the boat, his hand occasionally resting on a polished valve handle or a thick cable, taking the measure of his new, steel-encased world. In the days that followed, the shakedown dives began. This was the true test themament. The crew learned to cooperate with the immense external forces of the ocean. The first dives were slow, cautious explorations of the machine's ability to take in water through the main ballast tanks, a deliberate process of trading buoyancy for density. The sound of the ballast tanks flooding was a hollow, echoing rush, a profound glugging sound that spoke of the sea deliberately taking possession of the hull. Inside the control room, the crew monitored the dials with an almost religious intensity. The depth gauges began their slow, precise dance. Below the surface, the light immediately changed. The brilliant, scattered light of the day became a diffuse, uniform green-blue that filtered down through the periscope tube and the small deadlights. Through it outside transformed into a realm of shifting, watery shadows. The deep dive practice was a lesson in pressure. At depth, the boat was utterly silent save for the rhythmic tick-tick-tick of the trim pump, adjusting the vessel's perfect neutral buoyancy, and the constant, subtle creaking of the hull. This sound, a creak groan of the thick-pressure hull adjusting to the weight of the thousands of tons of water above it, was the most intimate and haunting sound a submariner knew. It weighs sound of the steel holding back the end, a constant, low-frequency reminder of the colossal power of the deep. It was not a violent sound, but a steady, persistent metallic complaint that soon became a comfort, a sign that the boat was doing its job. The air quality, too, began to change. On the surface, the ventilation allowed fresh, cold air to course through the boat. Underwater, the air became a closed system, recycled and, gradually warming. It acquired the complex, layered aroma of human occupation, wool from the uniforms, cooking fat from the galley, the subtle, metallic tang of the batteries, and the ever-present, faint oil smell from the machinery. It was a smell unique to the deep, a heavy, intimate atmosphere that fostered a unique kind of communal existence. The days of training moved into weeks. The crew learned to sleep in the constant gentle sway and the soft repetitive vibration of the electric motors. They learned to move through the tight corridors and past the humming machinery without touching it, anticipating the shifts and changes of the boat in the water. The boat became an extension of their own bodies, a metallic skin that separated them from the crushing, endless void outside. The preparation for the first long patrol involved the careful, precise loading of theta. These long, gleaming silver cylinders were the raison d'etre of the boat, and they were handled with a quiet reverence. Each one was slid along the oiled rails into the torpedo tubes in the bow, a process that required teamwork, silence, and absolute. Once loaded, the boat felt full, heavy, and primed. Finally, the day of departure arrived. It was a late autumn morning, the sky a vast, monotonous sheet of grey. The harbor waters were choppy, disturbed by the light, brisk wind. The U-96 cast off its mooring lines, the clunk of the heavy hemp ropes falling on wet wood of the pier. The diesel engines rumbled to life, a deep, resonant sound that promised long miles and sustained power. The slow journey down the channel was an exercise in solemnity. The shore passed by slowly, the grey buildings of the naval base, the distant silent figures of the dockworkers, the navigational buoys bobbing heavily in the current. The wind, cutting Ancleon, swept over the bridge where the captain stood, his collar turned up against that chill. The captain felt the deck vibrate beneath his boots, the smooth, steady pulse of theta cells working. He could smell the cold salt water mixing with the engine fumes, osmol that now defined the start of the mission. The transition from the safety of Thielen to the commitment of the open sea was not sharp. It was a slow, gradual fading offshore until the world was reduced to only three elements: the churning water, Thevist cold sky, and the reliable heavy metal hull beneath him. The coastline finally became a low, dark smudge on the horizon, then disappeared. The wind picked up, howling softly in the rigging and around the edges of thickening tower. The waves became longer, deeper, and more purposeful, beginning the characteristic slow, ponderous pitching motion of a boat designed to go under, not right atop the surface. Below deck, the crew settled into the rhythm of the patrol. Watches were established. The radio operator, wearing his heavy woolen sweater, sat in the small the glow of the dials reflecting in his glasses, listening to the static-laden breath of the world. The chief engineer meticulously monitored the diesels, his ear trained to distinguish the health of the machinery from any nascent fault, wiping down polished brass fittings with an oily rag. The galley was in continuous low-level operation. The smell of cooking stews, preserved vegetables, and the ever-present, comforting aroma of baked bread drifted through the boat, a deliberate psychological counter to the cold, antiseptic scent-off steel. The cook, his apron perpetually stained, worked in a space barely larger than a cupboard, yet his work was the anchor of morale, a familiar comfort in an increasingly alien environment. The slow, steady pulse of the voyage continued. Hour after hour, mile after mile, the U-96 made its way west, driven by the ceaseless work of the internal combustion engines. The ocean provided a soundtrack of its own, the hiss of the wake against the hull, the thump of a wave hitting the bow, the low, powerful thrumming that transmitted roar the sea and up into the boat's structure. The sky above was now a magnificent, infinite presence. At night, when the diesel fumes cleared and the eyes adjusted, the stars were a cold, brilliant, overwhelming chin of light, utterly divorced from the world of cities and land. The man on watch on the bridge was suspended between the polished steel deck and the infinite cosmos, as solitary figure listening to the wind and the relentless march of the waves. The U-boat was now deep into the patrol transit zone. The weather growing colder, Thesia becoming rougher. The motion of the boat was a constant, tiring presence, yet one that the crew adapted to with remarkable speed. They learned to brace, to compensate, to perform all their tasks while the deck was perpetually moving beneath. This adaptation was a quiet, internal process, a recalibration of the inner ear and the balance centers, making the submarine environment the new, temporary normal. The ultimate objective, the hunting grounds in the mid-Atlantic, remained many more days of steady travel away. The captain spent long silent hours in the control room, bent over the charts with the navigator. The charts, large, heavy pieces of paper, were spread out on the polished wood table. They were beautiful, detailed maps, filled with careful lines of longitude and latitude, depth markings, and the neat, penciled lines tracing the projected course. The process of navigation was slow, meticulous, and essential. Fixes were taken by sextant when the sky allowed, requiring a brief, cold exposure on the bridge. When thesters were hidden, the reliance shifted to dead reckoning, trusting the carefully logged compass, readings, the engine, RPMs, and the passage of time. It was a navigation built on trust, trust in the instruments, trust in the men, and trust in the fundamental dreamery of the world. As the boat pushed further from the coast, the sense of isolation grew. The air was entirely different now, raw, untamed, and smelling purely of the endless, deep ocean. The wind, when they were on the surface, felt as though it had traveled thousands of, carrying nothing but the cold, vast emptiness of the sea. It was a truly solitary world now, enclosed by a sphere of churning water and a vault of unforgiving sky, theonly constant being the steady, mechanical symphony of the U-96 itself. The long, silent vigil had truly begun. The great transit had concluded. Not with a sudden stop, but with a slow, deliberate craze in engine revolutions. For days, the U-96 had pushed westward on their surface, a dark, fast shadow in the rolling grey wastes of the North Atlantic. Now, the captain had given the order to enter the designated patrol box, a vast, lonely square of ocean, defined by lines on the navigator's chart. The rhythm of the boat shifted immediately, transitioning from the sustained, powerful thrum of the high-speed easels to a gentler, more cautious pulse. The surface running continued, but it was now a matter of maintaining position, not covering distance. The smell that perpetually permeated the boat, a complex aroma of fat oil, diesel residue, and salt spray, seemed to settle and deepen into the steel itself. The chief engineer, a man whose entire existence was tied to the health of the machine, moved among his charges, the diesels, with the quiet pride of a parent-tending sleeping giant. He wiped the brass fittings, listened to the subtle variances in the engine's beat with a stethoscope, and recorded the temperatures in his meticulous logbook. The engine room, located deep in the stern, was the warmest part of the boat. It pulsated with a low, consistent heat, smelling strongly of lubricants and combustion. The metal walls were subtly slick with moisture and oil vapor, catching the light from the low-hanging bulbs in a greasy, amber sheen. The sounds here were dense and comforting, the hiss of compressed air lines, the clack of injectors, and the overwhelming bass rumble of the heavy pistons turning the screws. As the boat slowed, the sensory world for the crew began to change from the aggressive edge of travel to the introspective quiet of the hunt. The bunks, which had offered little risk during the heavy pitching of high-speed transit, now became slightly more stable. The crew settled into the tight, three-high metal frames, the thin mattress offering only small cushioning against the cold steel beneath. Sleep came in staggered periods, punctuated by the shifting of the deck plates as men changed watch or moved silently through the narrow passage. The air in the living quarters was heavy, a blend of damp wool, the lingering scent of stale coffee, and the inescapable odor of unwashed bodies confined in a Yet, this combination of smells, though objectively unpleasant, was profoundly familiar and, therefore, soothing. It was the scent of communal endurance, the smell of being safely enclosed together against the colossal indifference of the deep dark. The transition into the patrol zone heightened the importance of one man above others, the orchardman, or hydrophone operator. His station, a small, dark corner near the control room, was the ear of the submarine. It was shielded by heavy curtains to maintain absolute darkness, allowing his eyes to rest while his hearing became. This was the quiet war, fought by pressure waves and frequencies. The hydrophone console itself was a beautiful, intimidating piece of German engineering, large, heavy, and covered in polished black bakelite dials and thick, insulated wires. The operator sat with the heavy rubber-rimmed headphones clamped to his ears, his hand resting lightly on the rotation wheel that swung the listing apparatus beneath the boat through a full 360 degrees. In the patrol zone, the boat spent a substantial amount of time submerged, gliding zoantly beneath the waves on the electric motors. This was the true state of the U-boat, the silent hunter. The process of the dive itself was a practiced, synchronized ritual of mechanical obedience. The klaxon, when sounded, was never a shock, but a known signal that triggered immediate, rehearsed action. Token. The control room became a flurry of controlled movement. The heavy, circular ballast vent levers were thrown open with a metallic clank. The rushing sound of the sea invading the ballast tanks was a hollow, powerful glug-glug-glug that reverberated through the hull, announcing the deliberate trade of air for water as the boat passed the critical point of neutral buoyancy. The pitch of the deck shifted, feeling heavy and purposeful as the diving planes, controlled by the helmsman, bit into the water. Inside, the world became hushed. The diesel engines were silenced, and the inert mass of the vessel now moved forward by the silent power of the batteries. The electric motors, located in the aft section, produced only a soft high-frequency, a sound that was barely audible above the low, constant creak of the hull adjusting to pressure. This pressure sound was the defining noise of the deep, not a harsh noise, but a gentle, resonant complaint from the steel that spoke of its strength. It was the sound of safety, the knowledge that the crushing outside force was being perfectly held at bay. The hydrophone operator, deep in the silence, experienced a world utterly unique to these. When submerged, the boat became a giant, highly sensitive ear. The noise off the surface, the crashing waves, the wind was filtered out, leaving only the shifting soundtrack of the deep. The background noise was a quiet, steady roar, the biological sound of the ocean, the distant shuffling of currents, the deep bass of geological activity. Into this endscape, the operator listened for the faint, unnatural sounds that meant contact, the distant high-pitched whine of a steam turbine, the distinct thump-thump-thump-thump of propellers, or the irregular, soft swoosh of a hull cutting through the water. The act of listening was an intense, meditative state. The operator was trained to distinguish between dozens of different sounds. A close-running freighter propeller might sound like a steady, rhythmic clatter-clatter, while a distant Moderna propeller would be a fine high-pitched singing sound. He learned to identify the tone of the vessel, the pitch of the engine, the cavitation of the screw, and used the boat's own rudimentary, plotting instruments to establish the bearing. The silence of the submerged boat was essential for this work. Every movement by the crew was suppressed. Feet moved on rubber soles. Commands were given in soft, almost whispered tones. Even the act of drawing a pencil across a chart table seemed definingly loud in this underwater sanctuary. The men communicated through small gestures, raised eyebrows, and the quiet, focused intensity in their eyes. Days passed in this deep rhythm, up to the surface at night to run the diesels, recharge massive batteries, and ventilate the stale air. Down to the quiet, dark depths by day to listen and wait. The cycle was relentless, shaping the men into creatures of the boat. Their circadian rhythms became divorced from the sun and tied to the demands of thepatry. They ate cold food in the dark, slept when permitted, and lived by the constant need to conserve the precious, enclosed environment. The galley, though tiny, provided moments of genuine, sensory warmth. The aroma of strong dark coffee, brewed in a continuous process, was one of the few smells that could compete with the underlying diesel and wool. The coffee was thick, almost syrupy, served in chipped enamel mugs, a momentary comfort that burned the throat and provided the necessary warmth and alertness during the long, dark watches. The feeling of the boat itself became a tactile language. The hand resting on a metal bulkhead could feel the almost imperceptible hum of the air circulation fans. The foot placed on a deck plate could detect the subtle swish of the trimming water shifting inth tanks. In the close proximity of the living space, the proximity of other human bodies was a constant, low-level source of heat and presence. The pressure hull was escintured by 22 men, each one intensely aware of the other's movements, breaths, and emotional states. The captain's quarters, a minuscule cabin offset from the control room, offered little privacy but marked his separation. His small wooden desk was bolted to the floor, holding his binoculars, his personal log, and a small, heavy piece of polished wood, a talisman against the chaos. He would sit for hours, not reading or writing, but simply listening to the boat, feeling its reactions to the deep currents, the shifts in ballast, and the quiet movements of his men. The air quality, when the boat was submerged for extended periods, became a matter of constant, controlled degradation. The air purification cartridges, filled with chemicals designed to absorb carbon dioxide, were carefully monitored. The subtle tang of ozone released by the charging batteries, and the slight metallic acidity in the back of the throat were the only signs of the contained environment. It was a conscious act of endurance, breathing the same air over and over, relying on the unseen mechanics to sustain life. The great external pressure, while held back by the steel, manifested internally as almost non-existent dampness on the metal surfaces. It was the atmosphericist of the dive. A small, subtle trickle might appear along a gasket or a rivet, immediately pounced upon by a watch officer with a rag and a note in the maintenance. These small signs of the ocean's proximity were treated with the utmost respect. They were whispers from the void, reminders of the violence held back by mere inches of steel. Then, on the 10th day submerged in the patrol zone, the world of quiet expectation was subtly fractured. The hydrophone operator, resting his rotation wheel and settling his breathing into the deep rhythm, heard it. It was not a loud sound, not a sudden, violent intrusion. It was a distant, high-frequency sound that was too uniform, too rhythmic to be natural. It was mechanical, faint, and utterly alien to the symphony of the deep. He froze, his head tilted slightly, adjusting the sensitivity of his amplifier with the utmost gentleness. The sound was still there, masked by the ambient ocean noise, but persistent. He slowly rotated the wheel, turning the array in a small, deliberate arc. The sound diminished, then returned, confirming its directional source. He found the precise bearing, a slow, high-pitched ween-ween-win that spoke of distant machinery turning. It was not a fast ship. The beat was too regular, too slow. It was the pulse of a freighter, deep in the water, heavy with cargo. He lifted a hand, tracing the outline of the captain's boot nearby. The captain, who had been standing in the corner, a dark silhouette, knew the gesture instantly. He leaned in, placing his head next to the operator's, and adjusted the spare set of headphones. For a long moment, the two men shared the alien sound, the distant, mechanical breath of another world, of the surface, of contact. The captain's face, dimly lit by third safety light, showed no sudden excitement, only a profound, immediate focus. Heckle feel the faint, high-pitched sound entering his inner ear, a vibration of intent, a new element in the boat's quiet ecosystem. He straightened slowly, nodding once. His movements were slow, controlled, and deliberate, a physical manifestation of the need to conserve silence. He walked a few feet to the navigator's station, which was shrouded in the slightly brighter amber light oft working lamps. He spoke, not in a whisper, but in a low, resonant tone that courageous enough to the nearby watch officers via ear Fnef, grad steuerbord, langsamer Horchert, meldet, Liesig, Probunguskags, 45 degrees starboard, slow speed, hydrophone reports fant propeller noise. The navigator immediately bent over the chart, his dividers moving with slow drawing arcs on the paper based on the bearing and the estimated distance that the operator had already provided. The chart, the beautiful hand-drawn map oft deep, was now receiving its first critical mark in days. A pencil dot representing the position of an unseen, slow-moving enemy vessel. The boat's internal state shifted instantly. The deep, meditative calm was replaced by taut, focused anticipation. Every crewman remained in place, but the air felt charged, suddenly thin. They knew, even without hearing the contact themselves, that the boat had found its purpose. The long journey, the days of deep listening, had culminated in this one faint acoustic whisper. The helmsman adjusted the rudder controls with minute delicacy, compensating forth deep current, guiding the vessel slowly onto the new bearing. The sound of the electric motors, already a mere whine, was deliberately reduced further. The boat settled even more quietly into the water, a massive steel fish, gliding with absolute minimal disturbance. For the next hour, the U-96 approached the unseen target. The hydrophone operator became the absolute center of the world. The sounds of the distant freighter grew marginally louder, resolving from a mere hiss into a distinct one-way mwum of the heavy screw, turning in the water the unmistakable signature of a merchant ship. The captain remained close, his posture still, his breath shallow, trusting the steel, the machine, and the intense focus of the man with the headphones. The sensory details of the boat, during this approach, were amplified by the tension. The smell of the batteries seemed sharper, the metallic temps more insistent. The low structural creaking of the hull felt more immediate, a reminder of the fragility of their still-encased reality. The time had come for the next step. The brief, necessary betrayal of their own silence, the periscope up. The order was given softly, a command that felt heavier than the simple words. The petty officer in charge of the optics moved with a careful, almost painful slowness to the heavy brass tube. The hydraulic system, designed for such operation, hissed gently as the long, thin stalk began its ascent. The captain pressed his eye to the rubber eyepiece. In the darkness of the tube, the world of the surface was suddenly, violently present, a flash of dark gray water, their churning surface, and then, slowly resolving through the spray, the large blocky silhouette of a freighter, riding low in the water, heavy with the weight of its unseen. The brief, sharp light filtering down the optics tube was the first pure sunlight the captain had seen in hours. A momentary, shocking intrusion into the dim, eternal twilight of the control room. The observation was swift, precise, and utterly silent. He noted the ship's course, its estimated speed, its profile. It was alone, uncourted, a solitary vessel in the great, desolate hunting ground. The information was delivered to the navigator in the semi-low controlled tone, who immediately began the complex, necessary calculations for the intercept. Find Eistgesetz. Ein off-to-pick station enemy is sighted. A single freighter, 2 battle stations. The shift was complete. The boat, having left the world of passive listening, was now an active, mechanical predator, gliding through the silent water, guided by the ghost of a distant propeller beat, preparing its slow, deliberate attack. The hunt had begun, and the 22 men of the U-96 were now moving with the single-minded focus of the deep game. The boat was now a coiled spring, operating under a heightened state of mechanical and human synchronization that transcended mere efficiency. The air in the control room, already dense and warm, grew heavy with the collective effort of absolute. The command to battle stations was not a sharp alarm, but a soft, pervasive decree that ordered every molecule of sound within the steel hull to cease movement. The initial sighting of the target ship began the long, deliberate approach, a tactical ballot governed by the immutable laws of hydrodynamics and acoustics. The U-96 crept forward on its batteries, its speed reduced to a mere crawl, a silent, gliding movement measured in fractions of a knot. The electric motors, running at their lowest possible, produced a sound so subtle it was felt more than heard, a faint, rhythmic thrum deep in the deck plates. The captain remained fixed at the periscope, his eye socket molded to the rubber cup, his breath steady and slow. He tracked the freighter, its dark hull riding the swell, noting its slow, ponderous movements. His observations were relayed to the torpedo officer, who stood ready with the crucial instruments. The torpedo data computer, TDC, The TDC was the center of this meticulous planning. It was a mechanical calculator, a complex array of gears and levers that translated the captain's visual data range, speed, bearing of the target into the precise magnetic settings and gyro angle required for the torpedo. The sound of the TDC was a high-precision symphony, the soft whir of internal mechanisms, the light click of the dials being advanced, and the faint scrape of the pencil marking the final solution on the small slateboard. The approach lasted for what felt like an eternity, but was perhaps only for. This was the true nature of the hunt, long periods of intense, physical stillness, punctuated by brief, explosive action. The crew's training had conditioned him for this, the ability to hold a single, difficult posture for long stretches, to manage its anxiety with slow, deliberate breathing, and to allow the mind to flow with the mechanical rhythm of the boat. In the forward torpedo room, the crew waited by the tubes. The air here was coldest, dampest, and held the faint, acrid smell of the torpedo fuel, a mix of alcohol, air, and brass polish. The long cylindrical bodies of the weapons were slid back into the tubes, the smooth, cold metal resting against the rails. The final check of the depth and magnetic settings was performed by touch, the pressure of the fingers reading the minute adjustments on the controls. The moment of readiness was signaled by a small, quiet action, the opening of the outer tube doors. This action was performed hydraulically, and even through the complex machinery, the sound of the ocean water pressing against the outside of the inner hatch door was audible. It was a dull, heavy thud, a sound that instantly connected the crew to the immense, liquid void just beyond the steel. The captain's voice, when he finally gave the firing command, was low, steady, and devoid of sharp inflection, almost a conversational murmur. Raw Eins los. Tube 1, fire. The firing was not the chaotic release of energy one might expect. It was a deep, powerful, internal whoosh as the compressed air expelled the torpedo from the tube. Immediately, the bow of the heavy submarine lurched upward, losing the immense weight of the weapon. This pitch shift, a sudden, unexpected upward tilt, was immediately compensated for by the stern plainsman, his hands moving the control wheel with disciplined speed and fluidity, adjusting the trim to hold the boats leveled following the firing. A period of absolute, deafening silence descended. Every owner listened not for the target but for the torpedo. The weapon, running on silent, compressed air and its own internal gyroscope, was now a separate entity, a metallic fish, swimming toward its destiny. If the torpedo ran correctly, its movement was virtually silent to the hydrophone. The sound they waited for was the impact, minutes stretched into an intolerable eternity, filled only by the creak of the hull. The crew breathed shallower. Time, which had flowed like a river, now became viscous, slow, and heavy. Then, the sound arrived. It was not a sharp crack, but a deep, resonant, underwater GNG, a profound, non-directional sound wave that traveled through the ocean and struck the U-boat's hull like a massive, distant hammer blow. Immediately following, the deeper, more localized rumble of the freighter's structure collapsing could be heard, followed by the muffled, hollow sound of air escaping from the ruptured hull sections. The immediate reaction was not cheering, but a renewed, more profound silence. The act was complete, but the danger was just beginning. The powerful acoustic reverberation of the explosion was now acting as a signal flare for any potential escort vessel within miles. Alarm, Volveros alarm, full speed ahead. The order for evasion was a quiet urgency. The electric motors were pushed to their maximum, the powerful yet silent surge of current draining the batteries rapidly. The low whine of the motors became a slightly higher-pitched scream, a sound that was masked by the violent, churning noise they created in the water, the sound of cavitation, the sound of bubbles forming and collapsing around the screw blades. The captain ordered the boat down, deeper and faster than before. The depth gauges in the control room began to spin downwards, the needles blurring past the numbers. The pressure hole groaned louder now, a sustained low-frequency complaint that was ignored by the concentrated men. This deeper descent meant colder water, increased, and a better chance of slipping beneath the thermal layers of the ocean. The thermoclines, which could deflect the surface-based acoustic detection systems. The hydrophone operator, his headset now filled with the chaotic noise of the sinking freighter, the creaks, groans, and the inevitable rush of water, was frantically attempting to locate any new, threatening sounds. His face was beaded with sweat, intense concentration burning through the fatigue. He was listening for the ping of active sonar, the high-frequency shriek that meant a hunter was actively searching the next long period. The evasion was the psychological core of the submariner's life. It was a pure exercise in patience, silence, and trust. After the initial surge of power, the boat reduced speed to a near settling gently onto the bottom if the depth allowed, or hovering silently in the water column using the minimal force of the trim controls. The air inside became heavy, stale, and hot. The internal temperature of the boat often rose dramatically during extended submerged periods. Fueled by the collective body heat of the crew and the slight warmth radiating from the machinery, sweat was not wiped away but allowed to cool, clinging to the skin and dampening the wool uniforms. The smell became overwhelmingly human, a close, musky odor of damp fabric, unwashed skin, and old, recycled breath. The physical culture of the evasion required an almost Buddhist level of self-control. No one coughed, no one cleared their throat, no one shifted their posture unnecessarily. Even the heavy leather boots were carefully removed and placed on the deck plates taper-evened. The smallest tap of a heel on the steel, the slightest noise, the scratch of a fingernail on a bulkhead, the soft clink of a mess kit could be transmitted through the water and betray the boat's location. The food during this period was cold, often eaten in the darkness with a fork by feel. The crew consumed small, quiet portions, dark bread, cold sausage, or preserved cheese. The act of eating was slow, deliberate, a quiet effort to maintain energy without creating a whisper of noise. The water sipped from the canteens was warm and flat, tasting off the metal container, yet it was a necessary ritual of endurance. The only true sound allowed was the continued, relentless work of the hydrophone opera, who now became the collective nervous system of the entire vessel. His quiet, strained whispers to the captain were the only currency of reality. Suddenly, the expected threat arrived. Not a ping of active sonar, but the unmistakable, deep roar of distant, high-speed propellers, the signature of a destroyer. The sound was not constant. It would appear, grow louder, then fade, indicating the escort was sweeping the area, crisscrossing the debris field left by the sinking freighter. The hydrophone operator reported the contact with minimal words. Zue, schnell unhörnd, 2 screws, fast. Approaching the presence of the destroyer turned the quiet psychological tension into a profound, existential weight. The captain gave a single, quiet order: "Ales stoppen, totenstill." Stop all machinery. Deathly silence. The boat stopped moving entirely. The whine of the electric motors died. The faint hum of the ventilation fans ceased. The internal world of the U-boat went absolutely silent. The only sound remaining was the gentle, structural creak of the hull, a sound that, terrifyingly, felt far too loud. This was the extreme test, the deep, silent wait. The destroyer's propellers became the loudest sound in the universe, a high, fast thrum-thrum that vibrated through the water and resonated directly into the U-boat's steel skin. The crew could feel the sound in their teeth, in the soles of their feet, in the vibrations of the metal bulkheads. The destroyer passed directly overhead. In that terrifying minute, the sound was overwhelming, a colossal, grinding roar that seemed to tear at the submarine. The pressure wave from the passing hull shifted the U-96 slightly in the water column, causing a slight, unsettling sway that was immediately compensated for by the silent, manual movements of the diving plane operators. Then came the ping. The active sonar of the destroyer was a sharp, high-pitched ping, a brief aggressive pulse of sound energy. It was a sound of immense technological confidence, a blind, searching probe into the deep. The crew tensed, waiting for the return echo. The silence he thought followed the initial ping was agonizing, a frozen moment of pure, suspended fear. The return echo never came. The silent, non-moving boat had slipped below the Thermocline and was perfectly balanced, rendering its metal form invisible to the surface hunter. The destroyer continued its slow, sweeping pattern, its rhythmic pinging fading into the distance. For the next 4 hours, the U-96 remained in totenstill. The air grew heavier, the heat more oppressive. The collective psychological state of the crew was one of profound, managed exhaustion. They were running on sheer willpower and the knowledge that movement meant detection and death. Every sensory input became amplified. The soft, quiet drip of condensation from an overhead pipe, the small, involuntary gurgle of Eamon's stomach, the low, steady tick-tock of the control room clock, marking the passage of the destroyer's orbit. The captain remained statuesque, his mind entirely focused on the sound reports and the slow, deliberate plotting of the destroyer's fading patterns. He was the anchor AFCOM, his presence dictating the total stillness of the boat. He drew deep, slow breaths, allowing the heavy, stale air to fill his lungs, finding the meditative quality in the forced stillness. Finally, The hydrophone operator whispered the signal of release. Find Enfant sich, Gurgushva Blas enemy pulling away. Noise fading, the order to resume movement was given softly. Langsam Fahrt, Lufter, and Slot. Speed, start fans. The gentle whine of the electric motors and the soft hum of the ventilation fans returning was an immense, palpable relief. It was the sound of life returning, the promise of fresh air to come. The rigid posture of the crew broke slightly. Silent, exhausted nods of confirmation were exchanged. The immediate danger had passed, and the U-96 was once again a silent, gliding shadow, moving slowly away from the city of its attack, deeper into the endless, forgiving ocean. The successful evasion marked not an end, but a return to the endless, grinding rhythm of the deep patrol. The intense, focused energy of the attack and the subsequent escape had burned brightly, but it was replaced by the low, constant ember of isolation and fatigue. The U-96 was now truly alone, a pinprick of steel and humanity suspended within the colossal, indifferent volume of the North Atlantic. Days blurred into a single, continuous experience, marked only by the shifting of Thuarchus and the necessity of maintenance. The internal life of the submarine settled into a pattern of careful, mechanical ritual. Every crewman had a primary duty, but also a secondary, ceaseless chore: the management of the atmosphere, the preservation of the machinery, and the conservation of supplies. The air quality, though refreshed daily during the brief surface run, was perpetual. The chief engineer meticulously monitored the filtration systems, checking the pressure seals and the chemical scrubbers. The residual smells of diesel, stale cooking oil, and damp wool were permanent fixtures, yet the men had grown so accustomed to them that a clean, fresh smell would have been jarring. This heavy, warm air, perpetually circulated by the soft hum of the fans, became the comforting, familiar scent of home. The routine of the watchers was the temporal anchor. 4 hours on, 8 hours off, an unbroken cycle that divided the day into precise, predictable segments. The transition between watches was a quiet, almost silent ritual performed in the perpetual twilight of the interior. The relief watch would arrive, their boots carefully removed, their steps soft in the deck plates. A brief, whispered exchange of information: depth, speed, any unusual noises, and the new shift would take over the reins of the boat. The most constant chore was the battle against condensation. The cold water outside met the warm, heavy air inside, causing moisture to constantly weep from the bulkheads, pipes, and electrical conduit. This dampness was the persistent enemy, threatening sensitive electronics and fostering corrosion. Crewmen dedicated hours towering down the walls with thick rags, collecting the moisture in buckets, and trying to keep the delicate balance of the boat's environment intact. The deck plates, made of steel and often covered with a thin layer of wooden slats in the living areas, were perpetually slick. The constant shift of the boat in the swell meant that, even when standing still, the muscles of the leg and core were engaged in a continuous, minute effort to maintain balance. This deep, internal physical exertion was part of the patrol's subtle fatigue, a constant, low-level workout demanded by their relentless motion of the sea. In the galley, the cook was the keeper of morale. His work was constrained by the rapid depletion of fresh supplies. The early days of fresh meat and vegetables had given way to preserved foods, tins, and dried goods. Yet, his ingenuity ensured variety. The small copper stovetop became a source of powerful, comforting smells: the heavy, earthy aroma of potato stew made from dehydrated flakes, the sharp, vinegary smell of pickled cabbage, and always the omnipresent scent of brewing coffee. The communal dining was less about food and more about the brief, shared moments of normalcy. The crew gathered in the forward torpedo room, where the bunks served as seating, eating their rations from shallow metal bowls. The conversations were subdued, focusing on the immediate, the weather, the machinery, or the last whisper. The psychological maneuvering during these long periods was the preservation of routine, the fierce, collective commitment to behaving normally in an pressurized environment. The connection to the outside world. The distant rumble of political maneuvering was provided by the radio operator. His position was perhaps the most isolated, shielded by heavy curtains in his small booth, wearing headphones that connected him to the chaotic energy of the land war. The messages he received were sparse, coded, and often accompanied by intense static, the white hiss of the deep, restless atmosphere. Yet, when a signal broke, it carried the weight of the entire European conflict. Orders from command, reports of other patrols, distant propaganda broadcasts, or the slow, rhythmic tick-off to German news agency. The operator would translate the coded pulses into legible text, writing the messages in a small pad, the friction of the pencil against the paper, audible in the small space. These messages were the boat's fragile link to the grander, strategic world, reminding through that their isolated, mechanical vigil was part of a larger, terrifying conflict. The navigator, receiving these updates, would transfer the strategic information on that large, beautiful chart, the vintage map that covered the table in the control room. The chart, made of heavy aged paper, was marked with the delicate penciled lines of their own position, and now, the occasional cross or line indicating the reported positions of enemy convoys or the movements of friendly vessels. The captain would study this map for hours, his hands clasped behind his back, rockingly with the motion of the boat. He was not just looking at lines on paper, he was visualizing the currents, the waves, the weather patterns, and the strategic intentions often seen enemies thousands of kilometers away. The map was his crystal ball, a representation of a vast, complex, and unpredictable world that he had to simplify and control with the small, heavy vessel beneath his feet. The crew's psychological maneuvering during this period was also managed through more personal rituals. Men spent their off-watch hours carefully cleaning and maintaining their limited belongings, polishing the brass buckle of a belt, careful amending a tear in a thick woolen sock with a large needle, or reading a worn, doggy rod paperback that had been passed around the crew 3 times over. One of the most important elements of this internal culture was the periscope ritual. The periscope, the eye of the boat, was a complex, elegant piece of optical engineering that required ceaseless attention. The petty officer in charge of the optics would spend hours in his tiny domain, cleaning the lenses with specialized cloths, checking the pressure seals, and ensuring the complex gearing for the raising and rotation mechanisms were perfectly lubricated. The captain's use of the periscope was a moment of profound communion with the He would spend short, necessary periods rotating the massive tube, taking in the immense, desolate beauty of the open ocean. He saw the vastness of the water, the shifting textures of the sky, the low gray clouds that scudded across the horizon. These visual details, the specific, flat quality of the northern light, the spray of the wave crests were fleeting, but they grounded the crew to the reality of the external world they were constantly resisting. The constant, small sounds of the boat became the crew's sensory background, the gentle clatter of the hydraulic trim pump making minute adjustments, the faint squeak off a door hinge, the steady drip-drip of the water from the auxiliary storage tanks. These were the internal sounds of a living machine, a language that the crew understood intimately. Any sudden strange noise, a loud thunk from the bilge, a sudden hiss from a pipe was instantly noted and investigated with focused, quiet precision. The most difficult periods were the long stretches of submerged silence, necessitated poor weather or increased enemy air patrols. During these times, the U-96 would settle into the deep water, utilizing the batteries for minimal movement, conserving every watt of energy. The electric motors were almost entirely silent, and the crew's activity dropped to zero. The silence was the ultimate psychological test. The only true reality was the deep, resonant creak of the hull under pressure. In the absolute quiet, the men listened to their own internal sounds, the slow beat of their hearts, the rustle of their lungs, the soft gurgle of their stomachs. This enforced intimacy with the self and the machine was the culture of the U-boat, shared reliance on discipline and the physical integrity of the steel skin surrounding them. Sleep, in these conditions, was never fully restful. It was a shallow, intermittent state, easily broken by the slightest structural sound or the sudden hyperjet WHEEN of hydrophone operator shifting his array. The dreams of the crew were often vivid, filled with the contrasting images of the surface open fields, clean air, the sounds of water, or, conversely, the deep, crushing terror of the unyielding water outside. The political maneuvering, though distant, was always present in the captain's mind. He had to decide when to break the profound silence and risk exposure to transmit his report or receive new orders. These decisions were always a balance between the strategic necessity of communication and the immediate, tactical requirement of survival. The radio antenna was raised quickly, silently, and the brief burst of Morse code was sent out. A quick, almost apologetic disruption of the silence, followed immediately by the rapid, anxious descent back into the protective depth. The long, monotonous existence, however, fostered a unique and deep bond among they were a floating microcosm, a small, enclosed society dependent on absolute trust and mutual discipline. The shared endurance of the crushing weight, the starry air, and the constant threat forged a powerful, unspoken connection, the quiet culture of the silent service. This routine continued, day after day, until the final turn of the patrol, the moment the navigator, after consulting the long-range coded message, drew a new, decisive line on the aged parchment map, the bearing toward the convoy lanes, the move from patient waiting to active engagement, signaling the slow, final approach toward the culmination of their mission. Heightened tension, deep to period of monotony, was shattered by a single, resonant report from the hydrophone operator, a vast, complex symphony of distant machinery. It was not their single pulse of a lone freighter, but the heavy, rhythmic gathering of dozens of engines and the churning of scores of propellers, the sound of a major convoy. This was the culmination of weeks of isolation, the moment the U-96 was designed for. The atmosphere within the boat transformed instantaneously from quiet endurance to highly focused intent. The crew moved to action stations, their movements no longer sluggish from fatigue, but imbued with a sharp, controlled energy. There was a sense of profound mechanical destiny. The navigator swiftly marked the new strategic data onto the chart. The convoy was immersive, its bearing steady, moving through the pre-plotted attack zone. The captain, maintaining his stillness, initiated the long, silent stalking process. The boat submerged, gliding on the silent electric motors, adjusting its depth to utilize the patchy thermoclines, the horizontal layers of water density that could hide the U-boat from surface sonar. The approach lasted hours, a slow, meticulous weaving through the water column, utilizing every shadow and change in temperature. The hydrophone operator became the boat's external nervous system, reporting on the shifting density of the contact, the high-pitched whine of the fast escort vessels circling the perimeter, and the deeper, heavy whum-whum of the cargo ships forming the vast, central mass. The captain ascended the periscope, and what he saw was the grandeur of the enemy, a profound spectacle of industry and vulnerability. The convoy stretched across the horizon, a slow-moving steel city, with merchant hulls of all shapes and sizes, their superstructures dark against the pale wind-whipped sky. The escorts, sharp and fast, were mere shadows, darting purposefully on the flanks. The captain submerged again, relying on the brief visual data and the continuous psychostick input. The target selection was made, not the closest, but the largest, a heavy tanker riding low, laden with fuel. The torpedo officer, his face illuminated by the faint glow of the TDC dials, prepared the solution. The sound of the TDC's gears turning west, subtle hiss and click of destiny being calculated. The grandeur of the attack was the precision of the preparation. In the forward torpedo room, the final checks were made. The men stripped down to thin shirts in the hot, stagnant air, their muscles tense but steady. The long cylindrical torpedoes were now fully armed, their internal mechanisms humming silently. The captain maneuvered the U-96 into the perfect firing position. A slow, gentle turn that brought the bow tubes into line. The boat was dangerously shallow, barrelist submerged, gambling on the escorts not sweeping the area immediately ahead. The command came, deliberate and low. Feckisch, Rohr 1 bis 3, lost, shooter spread, tubes 1 2 3, fire. The firing was a rhythmic sequence of internal violence. 3 separate powerful WHOS of compressed air, each accompanied by the rapid upward lurch of Thebo as the tremendous weight of the torpedoes was suddenly released. The trim operators worked frantically, their control wheels spinning with disciplined speed, fighting the change in buoyancy to keep the boat level and silent. Immediately, the U-96 turned hard to starboard and dove steeply, utilizing the briefment of acoustic confusion created by its own attack. The sound of the ballast tanks flooding was a frantic, powerful roar that drowned out the quieter sounds of the internal motors. The men braced themselves against the sudden, steep pitch of the deck. Then, the sequence of impacts began. Not a single sound, but a staggered, rolling thunder gong. Gong. Gong as the torpedoes struck the massive hulls. Thetinka hit broadside, dissolved into a profound secondary explosion. The sound of thousands of tons of volatile fuel igniting traveled through the water as a deep, echoing BOM that rattled the teeth of every man in the submarine. The crew did not celebrate. The acoustic violence of the destruction was a double-edged sword. It confirmed success, but immediately painted a massive target on their position. The reaction from the escorts was instantaneous and ferocious. The deep, heavy thrum-thrum of the destroyer propellers, now running at full speed, intensified in the hydrophone. The U-96 was still dropping, trying to gain as much depth as possible. The first ping of active sonar was a high-pitched, insistent shriek, a sound that felt like a needle pressed into the brain. It was followed quickly by the return echo, sharp and clear. Pong! They had been found. Teeth 100 meter. Depth 100 meters. The captain roared, pushing the boat past their comfortable safety zone. Totens, ales, vol teeth. The boat plunged into deathly silence. The motors stopped. The fan ceased. Every man froze. The air instantly became still, hot, and heavy. The only sound was the profound, grinding creak of the pressure hull, a sound now infused with exit data. As the boat reached the crush depth warning zone, the escorts were directly overhead. The hydrophone operator, his hands shaking, reported the range shrinking to 0. The sound of the destroyer's hull passing over was a deafening, metallic rush, accompanied by the sound of the depth charges. Rolled off the stern racks. The first depth charge exploded far off the stern. It was a massive, non-directional whump that shook the entire boat with the force of a tectonic shift. Lights flickered, loose objects rattled violently. The pressure wave felt like a physical hammer blow against the hull, causing a momentary, sharp metallic twang that was instantly followed by the sound of water beginning to trickle from weakened pipe joints. The damage report was whispered. Lights out in the engine room. Minor flooding in the crew did not panic. They moved in the darkness, guided by muscle memory, dealing with the damage with disciplined, quiet efficiency. The second pattern of charges was closer, intended to bracket the U-boat suspension. These charges exploded with a violence that felt personal. KRA boom. The sound was sharper, more immediate. The lights in the control room went out completely. The compartment was plunged into absolute darkness, relieved only by the eerie glow of the phosphorescent paint on the depth gauges. The sheer mechanical precision of the U-96 became its salvation. Designed to withstand far greater pressures than the enemy anticipated, the hull held, though it groaned in protest. The crew huddled, listening to the cacophony of the hunt above, the destroyer's propellers, the continuous searching ping of the sonar, and the intermittent, colossal thunder of the explosions. The air quality degraded rapidly. In the darkness, the faint, acrid smell of chlorine gas, released by the agitation of the battery acid in the shock of the blast, began to mix with heavy stale air. A crewman quietly started the emergency air purification system, his movements slow and careful, battling the chemical threat in the dark. For over 6 hours, the sustained attack continued. The crew was forced to maintain the deathly silence, enduring repeated patterns of explosions. The captain stood motionless in the pitch black, his entire focus trained on the whispered. He directed the boat's slight silent movements, a slight change in depth, a gradual shift in bearing to throw the pursuers off. The psychological climax was the forced, communal trust. Each man depended absolutely on the silence and discipline of his comrades. The man with the hammer needed to trust the man by the hydrophone. The man by the damaged valve needed to trust the man controlling the trim. In the total darkness, their bond became a tactile shared reality, a mutual commitment to stillness and survival. Slowly, agonizingly, the frequency of the depth charge explosions began to diminish. The destroyer's sonar ping became weaker, more distant, as the escort widened its search area, assuming the U-boat had either been destroyed or was now far away. The sound of the propellers, once a deafening roar, began to fade into the background noise off the deep ocean. The captain waited for an additional hour after the last faint sound had vanished. He waited until the only acoustic input was the natural, deep roar of the ocean itself. Finally, he gave the order for the first signs of life. Luftpumpen and vorsichtig, sehr langsam air, pumps on carefully, very slowly. The soft hiss of the air pumps injecting air into the ballast tanks to achieve positive buoyancy was the sweetest sound the crew had heard. It was the mechanical Prometheus ascent, the slow, laborious climb back toward the surface and the realm of breathable air. The climb was measured in painfully slow meters. The light remained off, the boat running on minimal power to conserve the drained batteries. When the captain finally risked a brief, silent look through the periscope, he saw a black, moonless sky. The convoy was gone, the horizon empty save for a distant, orange glow, the pyre of the burning tanker, a vast, desolate torch marking the scene of their ordeal. The U-96, wounded but intact, broke the surface after nearly 10 hours in the dark abyss. The sound of the heavy ballast water rushing out of the vents was a massive, joyful cascading roar that announced their return to the surface world. The hatch was cranked open, the sound of the metal dogs turning loudly in the silence, the first breath of the cold, clean, wind-whipped Atlantic air that rushed down thickening tower was a physical shock, a profound, revitalizing sensory experience that cleared the lungs of the heat and chemical residue. The captain stood on the bridge, taking in the full, cold force of the wind and the sight of the limitless, star-strewn sky. The climax of the hunt had passed. They had survived the ultimate test of pressure, noise, and stillness. Now, the long, slow journey toward their resolution had begun. The climax of the engagement left the U-96 profoundly altered, a vessel that had been violently tested and found resilient, yet undeniably marked. The final leg of the patrol's long, contemplative journey back to the relative safety of the German-occupied French harbor was a period of introspection and meticulous triage. The boat ran exclusively on the surface, utilizing the powerful diesel engines, reserving limited electric power for only the direst emergency. The continuous thrum of theody cells, once a symbol of the outward journey, now sounded like a steady, rhythmic beat urging them toward home. The vibration permeated the hull, a low, comforting pulse that reassured the weary crew that the heavy steel shell was still intact and capable. The crew's focus shifted from the external threat to the internal repair. The sustained charge attack had caused subtle but persistent damage. Small leaks were contained, but the entire interior now carried a persistent, damp chill from the water that had breached the seals. The faint, acrid smell of chlorine gas and the deeper, metallic scent of heated, stressed steel were the lingering perfumes of the ordeal. The most vital ritual of the journey home was the deep, restorative clean. Every man participated in the effort to purge the boat of the chaos of the last days. Bilges were pumped, absorbing the cold, oily mix of bilge water, seawater, and accumulated debris. The control room brass was polished until it gleamed, a conscious effort to restore order to the environment and, by extension, to the psyche. The surfaces of the gauges, the polished wood of the chart table, and the smooth metal off the hatches were treated with an almost reverent attention. This physical act of cleaning was a form of silent psychological processing, scrubbing away the violence and replacing it with the predictable perfection of the machine. The crew's physical exhaustion was profound. The extended period of totenstill had required an immense, sustained expenditure of nervous energy. Men slept deeply but often fitfully, their dreams still echoing with the deafening crump of the depth. Yet, the long, uninterrupted run on the surface, with the hatch open and cold air coursing through the boat, provided the gentle, necessary balm. The air on the bridge, where the men took their watches, was invigorating, cold, clean, and smelling purely of the salt and the distant land. The sound of the waves breaking against the high bow was no longer an ominous presence, but a rhythmic, natural sound, a vast, comforting white noise that replaced the internal, mechanical anxieties. The captain spent long hours on the bridge, gazing at the horizon. His reflections were focused not on the grand political maneuvers of the war, but on the small, profoundments of discipline, the helmsman's steady hand during the first torpedo shot, the hydrophone operator's unwavering report during the sonar attack, the silent immediate mark to stop the leaks. The legacy of the patrol, for him, was the quiet, non-verbal commitment of his men to the machine and to each other. The navigator, meanwhile, carefully charted the reverse course, the penciled lines on the aged parchment map slowly closing the distance to the coastline. The map no bore the physical scars of the patrol, the delicate pencil marks of the ambush, the tight, frantic loops of the evasion, and the long, straight line of the journey home. It was a visual diary of their extreme isolation and endurance. As the boat drew closer to the European coast, the world began to reintegrate. The radio operator, who had kept an ear silenced during the risky transit phase, began to pick up distant, familiar chatter of coastal traffic, fishing vessels, coastal patrols, and routine military broadcasts. These sounds, once ignored, now sounded warm and familiar, a gentle return to the populated world. That the sense of isolation slowly lifted, replaced by a quiet, shared anticipation. The men began to talk softly about the details of their return, the hot shower, the clean sheets, the fresh food. These were simple desires, elevated by the weeks of confinement into profound, cherished goals. The culture of absolute silence was replaced by the low, continuous hum of conversation, a gentle sound of connection. The first sight of land was not a dramatic moment, but a slow, almost imperceptible shift in the horizon, a faint, dark smudge beneath the clouds. As the smudge resolved into the familiar low-slung hills and the jagged line of the coastal cliffs, a deep collective sigh of relief seemed to pass through the steel hull. The feeling was not one of triumph, but of gentle, profound arrival. The boat entered the protected waters of the channel. The sea, becoming calmer, fell on swells, giving way to the rhythmic chop of the harbor approach. The U-96 slowed, its diesels idling down, the rhythmic pulse fading to a low thump, 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 as it waited for the pilot vessel. The final moments of the patrol were characterized by a quiet, methodical precision. The deck crew prepared the mooring lines. The pilot, a man who smelled of shore life and dry air, came aboard, his presence a jarring reminder of the world they had been apart from. As the boat slid toward its berth on the quay, the crew looked out through the open hatch at the harbor scene, the static lines of other the bustling activity of Thedic Yard, the solid, unmoving presence of the land. The sense of profound protectivate, once held by the water, was now transferred to the unyielding concrete of Thedic. The slow, steady motion of the boat ceased entirely. The final sound of the patrol waist-heavy clang of the metal mooring lines being thrown onto the bollards, followed the immediate, absolute stillness of the boat coming to rest. The rhythmic thrum of the engines stopped. The hull ceased its structural creaking. The U-96 was home. The legacy of the long patrol was not the sinking of the vessels, but the survival of the small, deep world within the steel. It was a testament to the discipline, the mechanical precision, and the quiet, collective will to endure the weight and the silence. The experience was now internalized, a memory of sensory extremes, the deafening silence of the deep, the crushing sound of the depth charge, and the life-giving rush, oft cold, clean air. We leave the crew now, stepping onto the solid, unmoving ground, blinking in the harsh, stable light of the shore. Their journey in the silence is complete, and the machine that carried them is finally at rest. The deep sea holds the weight of history, and the quiet of the pressurized hull offers a profound rest. Allow the fading echoes of the ship's machinery, the rhythmic creak of the steel, and the memory of the immense, silent ocean to share your mind in stillness. Rest now, in the deep calm that follows the long journey. The watch is over, all is silent.